and welcome to Newsmakers for this Tuesday, November the 12th, 2024. I'm Louie Butko. Thank you so much for joining us on CHCH Podcast. And today I'm very pleased to be joined by political analyst Keith Leslie because, Keith, there is just so much to talk about. I wanted to talk Trudeau, Trump, Ford, and of course Doug Ford kind of puts that all together. I want to throw up what he said just this morning and get your opinion on it. He says free trade needs to be fair. Since signing on to the Mexico-Canada agreement, Mexico has allowed itself to become a backdoor for Chinese cars, auto parts, and other products into Canadian and American markets, putting Canadian and American workers' livelihoods at risk while undermining our communities and doing enormous harm to our shared economic success. If Mexico won't fight transshipment by, at the very least, matching Canadian and American tariffs on Chinese imports, they shouldn't have a seat at the table or enjoy access to the largest economy in the world. Instead, we must prioritize the closest economic partnership on earth by directly negotiating a bilateral U.S.-Canada free trade agreement that puts U.S. and Canadian workers first. And I want to start there, Keith, because why does Doug Ford put out this message today, and what's he trying to get across?
Well, I think he's perfectly reading the situation here. I mean, it's basically let's cut the poor cousins out of this mix here and use some very Trump-like language about, the largest market in the world and access to it. And let's face it, Canada and the U.S. pretty much move lockstep when it comes to most trade issues, especially, Trump slapped 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. Canada followed suit. I mean, and Mexico doesn't do that stuff. So he's making the very valid point that Canada is your willing trading partner. We're on the same level, basically, or more or less, as far as economies and dealing with each other, whereas Mexico plays by very different rules environmentally and economically. So I think Ford is actually, he's just trying to get out in front of this and position Canada. He's trying to force Trudeau here. Let's just make a bilateral agreement with Donald Trump. He's a very transactional guy. So let's give him some and we'll get some back and make sure that we protect Canadians' access to the U.S. market, especially the automotive sector. I mean, what if Trump slaps this 10% global tariff he's talking about on every country in the world? What does that mean for cars that, as we know, are made on both sides of the border now, Canada and the U.S. border? So there's an awful lot here, and I think Ford is just trying to get out in front of it, show Trudeau what we need to do as far as negotiating a deal with Trump, and basically just cutting Mexico right out of the picture.
Does this get Trump's attention at all, though? Trump's a very busy guy, having just been elected, and we'll get into that election and the repercussions of it. But does this is this a blip on the radar of Donald Trump's week right now?
Oh, certainly. I mean, Trump's busy putting together his cabinet and all the officials he's going to need to run the United States in his new administration. So what Doug Ford says may not get his attention, but it's going to get the attention of trade officials in Washington and in many states. In the states that Canada deals with directly, there's an awful lot of states where Canada is their number one trading partner. So it's very, very important that, Canadian politicians speak unified with this. Basically, we need to keep our trade relationship with the United States. We need to keep really good relations with this Trump administration. And as I say, we know Trump is exactly a very transactional guy. He's a give and get kind of guy. He's the art of the deal kind of guy. So as long as we deal with him on that sort of level, on a business level, and this is, I guess, Doug Ford, it's kind of ruthless politics on one point, but, cutting Mexico out of the deal doesn't actually hurt Canada's or Canadian politicians in any way. It's just kind of a ruthless way of saying we want to deal with Doug Ford, and we quite frankly don't care whether Mexico gets one or not. We're not looking for access to the Mexican market. We want access guaranteed and continued to the U.S. market.
Going into this election, Doug Ford put out a statement saying, it doesn't really matter to me who wins this election. We will continue to push our buy Can-Am or buy Am-Can, however he wanted to phrase it that day. Very different from when he sounded 6 years ago when he got in office, when everything was buy Ontario, buy Ontario. He wanted to put a open for business sign, right, on everybody's license plates and at the border. What do you make of Doug Ford's kind of shifting policy here in the last few years as premier when it comes to this bilateral agreement?
I think he just got a much better understanding of the actual trade relationship between Ontario and Canada and the various U.S. states and the America as a giant market. And he's come to realize it's just so important. So he's continued a tradition that actually Kathleen Wynne was working very hard on when she was premier, which is meeting with all the governors, not just the Great Lakes governors that we've traditionally, Ontario's had a pretty close relationship with, but meet with every governor you can and just make sure that they are aware of how much goods we import into Canada from them, from their particular states, and how much we trade with them. It's very, very important. So I think that's what we're seeing here is Ford and the states just, each of them getting dug in and set for some really, really big negotiations that are to come here. But is it on Donald Trump's plate right now? Doug Ford, no. Is even Canada on Donald Trump's agenda right now? I wouldn't think so, other than he knows that he's spoken about the fact that the Canada, U.S., Mexico trade deal is up for renegotiation in next year or the year after, and he wants a much better deal. So I think Canada's basically saying to Trump, you want a much better deal? Let's just cut Mexico right the heck out of it, and we'll get a Canada-U.S. deal that'll be much better for both our countries.
I want to get back to Ford in just a little bit because Bonnie Crombie had looked like a campaign announcement today talking about lowering taxes, her plan to do so. So we'll get back to that in just a second. Let's stick on Donald Trump because I haven't had the chance. We appreciate your amazing coverage, election day, election eve, post-election. You were all over the airwaves here on CHCH. So I was like, I got to get him in to talk about it. I was shocked at how quickly the results came in Tuesday night, how quickly it was called for Donald Trump. What did you make of basically Tuesday night through Wednesday? How did you react to the election?
Tuesday, when the results first started coming in and we could see Trump, he was clearly making some gains in areas he wasn't expected to. But by 11 o'clock, we were saying, geez, this is really looking like Trump's going to lock this up. And by midnight, basically, he had locked it up. Even though some of the battleground states were still to be called, for the most part, he knocked down that blue wall they were talking about, the Democratic wall. Remember, the opposite does. The conservatives are red there, and the Democrats are blue. They knocked down the blue wall, and that was supposed to, keep Trump from getting to the right number of seats he needs to win the presidency, but it didn't happen at all. I think most of us were kind of shocked because the polls had told us it was going to be so close. It was a coin toss, and it really didn't turn out to be a coin toss at all. It turned out that Trump overperformed in virtually every market that he could possibly want, almost every county, and Harris and the Democrats were wildly underperformed, and it appears an awful lot of Democrats stayed home, and that overall it became clear. We're hearing so many excuses in these postmortems about what the Democrats did wrong, what Trump did right, and I think the best one that I've heard and the most seemingly arriving at a consensus at this point is that it was an election about the economy. And that the Harris and the Democrats kept trying to make it about, we're saving democracy, which people I don't think in their hearts really felt was under that big of a threat. They'd had Trump before. He didn't destroy democracy in his first term. And, they're talking about saving democracy, whereas Trump was out there and he's talking about, I'm not going to tax your tips. I'm not going to tax your overtime. It's the economy. I'm going to make life better for you. And I think for an awful lot of people, that resonated. And in large part, I think, we're seeing around the world it's time for change elections. People are upset about inflation, the high cost of living. And, the Democrats, and they're coming back and saying, under Biden and Harris, inflation's coming down. Well, sure, inflation is down, but inflated prices haven't come down. They're still sky high, and the rate of increase is actually slowing a little bit. But for the most part, we're seeing people can't afford an awful lot of things. The food bank report out of Toronto today, just staggering, the huge number of people relying on a food bank every month. Life is so unaffordable for so many people in Canada and the United States, and Donald Trump spoke directly to that, despite all the craziness and the wild stuff he says and the threats against, vengeance against his political opponents and the enemies from within and all that. People just ignored all that and went, basically, it seems, right for a basic message. It's about the economy, and that Donald Trump is going to make life better for us. And Kamala Harris, when asked, how are you going to be different from Joe Biden, she froze. She couldn't even say, I don't know. That's the one question she really had to answer in an era of change elections around the world. She couldn't give an answer, and she got tossed because of it.
We've seen a few of Donald Trump's first few appointments. Mark Holman's going to be his border czar. Stephen Miller is going to be deputy chief of staff. Very hard right immigration people. Kristi Noem, it looks like, is going to be the head of Homeland Security. It seems like he's making it very clear. He ran on deporting illegal immigrants. That's going to be one of his first priorities. What do you make of his first few appointments and what that could mean for this administration?
Well, you've just nailed it right there. He's saying that my number one issue that I'm going to act on first and foremost is immigration and mass deportations. Mass deportations. I'm going to mean rounding up people, putting them in some sort of temporary restraining places or of some kind of jails or warehousing or something, and then deport them to where and at what cost. He says he doesn't even care what the cost is. It's not going to matter what the cost is because these people have to be taken, rounded up, and removed from the United States. We're already seeing some backlash from police officers. The LA police chief, I believe, said his forces have nothing to do with detaining and rounding up people for mass deportations. Some of the states are also saying the same thing. And I suspect, as he, remember when his first term, he tried something similar to this, an exclusionary law, and the courts ruled it, was unlawful, unconstitutional. So I suspect this sort of mass deportation thing is going to end up in the courts all over the United States at various levels. But Trump is making it very, very clear. I ran on this immigration thing. I'm going to close that border, and I'm going to deport these people who he says, are evil rapists and murderers and gangs that are running amok criminally throughout the cities of the United States. It's going to be interesting now to see if he pivots and says, the United States isn't as bad as I said it was, because he basically portrayed it as a hellhole that had just gone to rot, and he's the only one that could save it. I don't know if people bought all that message. As I say, I think it was more on the economy. But all of this, it just plays right into Trump's wheelhouse, and he's going to stick to his agenda. And I think, as I say, it's making it very, very clear immigration, mass deportations is going to be the first agenda item for him. And I think that's going to really upset an awful lot of people because it's going to be kind of heartless. And people who are apparently, when you talk to Stephen Miller, people who were born in the United States could be deported because their parents brought them there. Their parents came in illegally and then they were born there. It's just scary for so many people. And what's it going to mean for the American workforce when we know that so many illegal aliens are intrinsic to their workforce right now? So there's an awful lot of businesses very concerned about what's going to happen with this. But we're seeing him talking more about immigration. And I guess that's, if he's doing mass deportations, Canada has to be concerned about how many of those people are going to try and come across our border. But right now he's not talking about the trade and tariff, at least not yet, which I think could also be a very scary issue for Canada, as will Trump's insistence, and they're going to, his cabinet ministers are going to enforce this, that Canada has to really beef up its NATO spending, its defense spending, to get it to that 2% level that's required. And right now, under the Trudeau government, I don't think that's supposed to happen until 2032 or something like that. That's not going to be acceptable to the Trump government or the Trump administration.
All right, in the true pro that you are, you led me to my next topic, and that being Trudeau and Donald Trump. Keith Leslie, let's talk about that because, of course, these men have a relationship. They will point to the fact that they signed the U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement together, which is up for renegotiation next year. Trudeau can say, I know how to work with him. I know him. What do you make of this relationship? And we don't know how long Trudeau's going to be part of this relationship. But what do you make of these two men working together, at least for the foreseeable future?
It'll be interesting to see if Trudeau can actually try and play that Trump card, excuse the pun intended there, that he can, he's the one to have a better relationship with Donald Trump and the Trump administration than, say, Pierre Poilievre, which I think is going to be kind of doubtful. I'll be surprised if Trudeau tries to go there, because I think we all know that it's Poilievre and his Conservative Party of Canada that have taken pages directly out of Trump's playbook for the most part. And so they're softening us up for the fact that they could absolutely, the Poilievre team feels that they could have a much better and closer working relationship with Donald Trump because they're all conservatives, whereas they're going to portray that Trudeau just doesn't. But, Trudeau had a reasonable relationship with Donald Trump. They clearly sparked at one point at one of the conferences, but at other ones they seem to get along. Although I think, Trudeau was caught on a hot mic one time making fun of Trump at one of these conferences, and Donald Trump is not the kind of guy that ever forgets something like that, a slight like that, public slight like that. So I don't know. I think for the most part, it'll be a difficult relationship. Trudeau's smart enough to know how to go in. You have to flatter Donald Trump and you have to say, you're getting what you want here. But I think Trudeau does know how to deal with him. But can he deal with him as an easy relationship, as a friendly type of relationship, as Pierre Poilievre would likely have with Donald Trump?
Let's stick with Trudeau there because the polling, as we mentioned in that U.S. election, was a lot closer than we thought it was. The polling right now here in Canada is not very close at all, right? They run these scenarios. They say it's going to be a Conservative majority right now is what the polls are telling them. If the polls were that close and wrong in the States, and they're that close and wrong here, what can Trudeau take away from that election last week?
Well, I mean, there's always hope, isn't there? But he, in the United States, the polls were saying it was a coin toss. It wasn't quite a coin toss. But here in Canada, He's 20 points. The Liberals are 20 points behind the Conservatives in virtually every poll, and they're not gaining any ground. They're not making up, despite his insistence that he's the one to lead Canada into the next election, his fourth as Prime Minister. It seems that an awful lot of Canadians have jumped to the conclusion or come to the conclusion that they would like to see Justin Trudeau move aside and have someone else perhaps as Liberal leader, although it's getting pretty late in the ballgame for that at this point if they want to put someone else in to run them into the next election as leader. So right now we see Trudeau, who's vowing he's the right guy. He can come from behind. He's done it before, and he's the right guy that can take down the Conservatives and prevent them from forming a majority government in Canada. That in itself would be a huge task if they could prevent the Conservatives from forming a majority. Because right now, I mean, if they could hold the Conservatives to a minority, that would be a big accomplishment. But I think Trudeau himself, it seems, according to all the polls, he's the big millstone around the neck of the Liberal Party itself. They don't have an obvious successor. I think that's partly Trudeau's plan. He didn't have anyone right there to jump into the leadership race to take over from him, an obvious successor. So right now the Liberals appear to be stuck with Trudeau. And of course, they're rallying behind him. The so-called caucus revolt doesn't appear to have amounted to a hill of beans. They gave him a deadline in October. It came, it went. He didn't. He's staying there, and he's saying he's going to stay. So I think for the most part, Trudeau is going to be the man that's going to be in the position unless Canada has an election very soon, in which case it's a toss-up, right? I think he would be very, very lucky or really defying the polls maker and the odds if he could get reelected as a minority government leading the Liberals. But at this point, because it's a minority government, an election could come at any time. And if it doesn't come for another year as it's scheduled, an awful lot. That's a long, long time in politics. And, who knows what issue Trudeau would be able to pull out. Trump does something that Trudeau says, here, I have to prevent that from happening in Canada. And people might agree with him. You just never know. So it's an awful long time. But right now, the polls are such that Trudeau, and that's why we had a caucus revolt in the Liberal Party, because they can read the polls too. And they're saying, I'm going to lose my own seat if Trudeau doesn't leave.
Well, and I think, what can Trudeau learn from that election last week? I'm not sure if he can learn much. There's a bit of a fear that because Donald Trump won, a fear on my part, because Donald Trump won on such a right-wing, hard-line message, that Pierre Poilievre, who may not even be holding back right now, could be holding back, and he feels that messaging could win. How do you think Pierre Poilievre will react with the way the election was run in the States, and anything he can learn running here in maybe the next few months, next 6 months, next year or so?
Well, it'll be interesting. I mean, what we've witnessed all through the U.S. campaign was Poilievre and the Conservatives spent something like $3 million on ads throughout the U.S. election campaign, telling Canadians that Canada is broken and that we need him to come in and, help fix us and get us back together and pull the country back together and get our freedoms back to us. I think those messages, they really were heavy and they were played very negatively. But they struck home with a lot of Canadian voters, and that's why the Liberal caucus members were so concerned. They didn't think the Liberals were fighting back with their own messaging here. So I think Poilievre and the Conservatives are going to take several more pages out of Trump's playbook. They're going to look at what worked for him, what really did. And of course, we know it was his straight messaging on the economy. I'm going to make life more affordable for you. It's the exact same messaging we're seeing Doug Ford, using in his mini budget. I'm going to make life more affordable for you. I'm going to give you $200 rebate checks. Watch the Conservatives to absolutely take a few pages from Trump's playbook. But, going hard right in Canada doesn't really work, but you can do center and center right, and I think that's where Poilievre will land. He won't go, they're not going to talk about mass deportations in Canada. That's never going to be on the agenda here. But they are going to talk about, tightening up our border, making sure that when we accept immigrants, we accept the right immigrants and the right numbers at the right time, and that we have housing for them. I think that's where this government, the Trudeau government in particular, they didn't just bring in so many more hundreds of thousands of more immigrants. They didn't make sure that we had the housing and the spaces for them or for Canadians themselves, quite frankly. So that's where that issue has become a huge, huge vulnerability for the Liberals, and it's one I think the Conservatives will absolutely exploit as they run their campaign.
Yeah, and we've seen the Liberals already trying to, walk back some of those policies, limiting the number of temporary visas that they're handing out, student visas, and we're seeing the impact on that, of course. Bonnie Crombie this morning made what very much looked like a campaign announcement, talking about some promises that she'll make, to the point of Ontario's heading to the polls. How convinced are you that in the first 6 months of 2025, we'll be casting votes here in Ontario?
Oh, very. I'm very convinced that we're going to be doing that. I think what we're going to see is the legislature will adjourn in a couple of weeks for the Christmas break. They're not supposed to come back till the day after Family Day in late February. They'll probably leave that even another week or two, come back in March, have a couple of weeks of debate, introduce a spring budget. And that budget will be the Conservative campaign platform. Remember, they didn't have a platform last time. They don't need one. They'll use their budget this time. They'll bring in a balanced budget, because we know they were pretty much at balance already anyway. And then it'll be more of an election goodies. I mean, we're going to get the $200 checks in January and February. If that doesn't signal that an election is coming, I don't know what else is. And we also saw the Ford government. It was a little move that people didn't get a lot of publicity because of the U.S. election going on. But the Ontario government, the PC government, supported by all the other parties in the legislature, the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens, agreed to continue the per-vote subsidy that they get for every vote they got in the 2022 election. They'll keep getting, this was supposed to end this year. Doug Ford had promised to end it. He called it political welfare, said he wouldn't allow that to continue. Well, the Ford government wasn't able to continue with it. They're not raising as much money as they did since the huge Greenbelt scandal, and they couldn't have their big Premier's Dinner fundraiser last year. So this is a big benefit to the government itself, because it really benefits. The government's going to get close to $5 million a year in per vote subsidies. And so why did they extend that if they didn't want to have an election next spring? That's exactly why they did it. The other parties do get some money as well, but they don't get nearly that, because they didn't get the kind of votes that the PCs got. They don't get nearly as much money. But it is meant to help equalize the playing field. It's harder for the opposition parties to raise funds. So that's what the per vote subsidy was supposed to be for. And the government, when you're the governing power, especially a majority government like that, your ability to raise funds is exponentially so much greater than the opposition parties. But this basically becomes political welfare, as Doug Ford called it, for the government in itself. It's getting an awful lot of money, and that's going to help boost their political war chest, quite frankly. So I think there's so many signs that point to a spring election in Ontario. And also because Doug Ford wants to run against Pierre Trudeau, wants to run against Justin Trudeau. I'm so old, I covered his father. He wants to run against Justin Trudeau and not against Pierre Poilievre.
All right, we started this conversation with Trump. Well, we started it with Ford. We started with Trump, too, there, because what we talked about was there seemed to be, and this is a global trend, an anti-incumbency trend. And you would think that the government that took this province through COVID, through everything else, Ontario seems to be bucking that trend. How? How are they doing it? Because, like we said, the Americans voted the Democrats out of office. We've seen it across the world, this anti-incumbency. How are the Doug Ford's Conservatives bucking that trend?
Two things, really. First of all, Doug Ford is such a pragmatist. I mean, he's not a hard or small C conservative. He does what he thinks is popular with people, and an awful lot of what he does is popular with people. But also, the Liberals and the NDP, despite the fact that Liberals were decimated in the last two elections and don't have very many seats in the legislature at all, no official party status, they still poll at about the same amount as the NDP. So the progressive parties in Ontario basically get 25% of the vote each, and Ford gets 40 to 43% of the vote, and anything over 38, 39% of the vote in Ontario, because of the way the vote split, is a majority government territory. So even though Ford has had some scandals, people, they forgive him a lot on that Greenbelt scandal because he said he was sorry and he backtracked on it. He gave those lands back gave them the Greenbelt protection back to those lands that would have made developers, $8 billion in change overnight. So when he makes the apology, then he does the populist things. I mean, I don't think most people know that he, spent $250 million just to break the beer store contract a year early, but they do know that he put the beer, wine, and pre-mixed cocktails in the corner stores and the gas stations, and people think, well, Ontario's been so far behind in modernizing its liquor laws, they just give him credit for that. They don't see that there was a huge expense, quite frankly, for him to do it a year early. Again, this points as well, the beer store thing coming a year early, paying so much money to do it a year early, points again to a spring election here in Ontario.
Well, if we do get a spring election, which it very much looks like we do, we know we'll have you to help us through it. Keith Leslie, really appreciate you making the time here today. Always great to catch up with you, my friend.
Thanks for having me, Louie. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. That is Keith Leslie, and my thanks to him for joining me today, and my thanks to you as well, because we could not do the show without your support. We could not do the show without Laura Brody, who directed today's episode. Thank you, Laura. And hey, while you're here, make sure you like and subscribe to CHCH Podcasts, so you never miss an episode of this show or any of the other great shows we have for you. Or you can go to chch.com/podcast to find them, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. One more time, thanks for checking us out. From all of us here at CHCH, I'm Louie Butko. Have a great day.